Okay, I'm going to start kicking this off and going to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting. For me, that's the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I mean no offence by referring to both groups, and to the elders past, present and emerging for all of those groups. And I'd like to further acknowledge and pay my respects to all First Nations people who are the traditional owners and custodians of Australia's wetlands, from desert geos to the reefs. I'd also like to honour the cultural and spiritual connection to country, the continuing care and deep knowledge of these Indigenous people, and acknowledge and welcome anyone here today. And feel free to pipe in if you would like to. And I always do this, but my current work, I'm working on the Healthy Coorong Healthy Basin program, and we're working with the Nurrinjeri people who have native title over some of the Coorong. They're doing some really cool work, pulling together a whole bunch of their cultural knowledge, their stories about fish and birds and the changing of the seasons and water levels. And I'm just really always so happy to see us start to take this knowledge seriously, because I think we've lost a lot when we ignored all of that knowledge and tried to recreate it with Western science. That said, there's a lot of good in Western science, and there's a lot of good biology, ecology, conservation science that's happening. Lena here, who I'll introduce shortly, is an example of that, and she's working in a really cool lab doing some really interesting work. Firstly, I'll just say hi. I've been appointed Australia's inaugural Youth Wetland Ambassador, or the Youth Focal Point to the Ramsar Convention. Part of that, we are basically creating a network of young people who are working on wetlands across Australia. We've been running these monthly seminars. Feel free to send anyone you know my way if you want them to do a seminar. We've had some really cool people, some cool discussions, and linked people together afterwards. We've also got an in-person event in the ACT next Thursday, the 18th, where we'll go to Jerrabomberra, get one of the guides there to give a bit of a tour of Jerrabomberra wetlands, and then we'll go to Capital Brewery afterwards for a sundowner and some networking and, just hang out. So let me know if you want the details of that. It's next Thursday at 5 p.m. Other updates, we're putting on a side event at the Conference of the Parties in November at the end of this year. It's going to be an intergenerational dialogue. We'll have people from some NGOs, the Wetlands and Wildfowl Trust, potentially some researchers from a large Ramsar research centre in the south of France, and then a bunch of young people. We're going to do a pre-COP sort of online event for a bunch of young people working on wetlands at the end of October, before the COP, maybe mid-October. So that's all coming together pretty nicely. We've got a youth resolution that we're putting through, basically encouraging the Ramsar Convention to kind of incorporate young people more into its processes, and encouraging countries to incorporate young people more into their own wetland policies and processes. Anyway, that's enough of the ramble, but if you're interested, or if you know anyone who might be interested, please get in touch. Please send them my way. It's really good to see how many really bright people there are out there doing cool stuff. So I will pass over to Lena in a second. So Lena's finished earlier this year her honours, and her honours she's going to present. Thanks, Lena. So as you can see, she majored in zoology and English literature. Her honours, which she'll talk about, looked at how we measure shorebird populations and how that relates to the way that we decide which areas are important in terms of Ramsar sites and protected areas. She did her honours with Richard Fuller, who I'm hoping some of you have heard of. He's a world-leading expert in migratory shorebirds and their conservation. She's currently working with BirdLife before commencing her PhD in October 2022. And she'll talk about both the work she's doing with BirdLife and the PhD that she's commencing in October 2022. And the last thing I'll say before I hand over is that Catherine's just posted our youth draft resolution in the chat. Australia's also putting forward a youth resolution on better ways to measure migratory shorebird populations and to use those population estimates in international policy. So this really lines up well with some of Australia's, cares and considerations and the things that we're putting forward in the international space. Anyway, that's enough of a ramble. I hope you're all still awake. Lena, I'm going to pass it over to you and get you to kick it off, please.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you to Dylan. And I'd also like to say it's been very nice sort of communicating with you over the course of preparing this whole thing. You're very passionate and ready to go on all this, which is great. So the talk I'll be giving today is based on my honors research, which I finished recently, which was about defining important habitat for migratory species. If I can just change this, there we go. And what I hope this talk will be able to give you is a clear understanding, one, of why Australia's wetlands are so crucial for migratory shorebirds, but also two, in a larger sense, why we need to think really carefully about how we prioritize areas for conservation. And just before I start, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Rich Fuller, and BirdLife Australia for their help and support on this project. And I'd also like to say it's been a real privilege to use the data collected over the years by so many volunteers and rangers, traditional owners across Australia. This kind of work just cannot exist without them, so thank you. So to kick this off, there is an incredible, beautiful diversity of species that undertake seasonal long-distance movements, and I'd say each and every one of them is a real pain for conservationists. Because these species may migrate around the globe, but that does not mean that they've adapted to live just anywhere. The truth is that a lot of them breed, forage, and rest within a surprisingly small total area of land or sea, which is then, as you can see, scattered across multiple geographically distant locations. So you can sort of understand a migration route as a long chain of habitats like this. We just move around. And where the damage or loss of even one individual link in this chain can impact a disproportionately large fraction of the species population. But a second problem here, beyond that, is that not every link in this chain represents an equal conservation priority. So as you can see, I'm changing the dot size. But many migratory species, for example, will undergo aggregative phases. So basically a whole bunch of individuals gathering together to form a sort of bottleneck. And this can result in dramatic differences in local abundance among sites along their migration route. And this can make a population really very vulnerable to local threats. So an example of this I think you'll all recognize is the passenger pigeon. So you've got a really abundant migratory species, and in certain areas they're all coming together to form these really extraordinarily huge and dense aggregations, big enough to just block out the sun, which of course made them really easy to overhunt. Or maybe you've heard of the Rocky Mountain grasshopper, a migratory insect that formed aggregations just so huge that farmers actually built a church, which you can see here, begging the Virgin Mary to wipe them out. But divine interference aside, we know that this species went extinct due to intense localized land clearing. So their habitat just couldn't support numbers like that anymore. And the bad news is we're starting to see versions of this just play out everywhere on this planet. So we know we can't protect migratory species everywhere they occur. It would require an international reserve system of just absolutely unprecedented size, complexity, and expense, even for just one species. So in conservation, our compromise so far is to generally try and protect these species where they aggregate, because we know from experience, we know from the passenger pigeon, that modifying these sites or causing increased mortality at these aggregation sites can and does trigger really steep population declines. So here's a problem. How do you define aggregation? Is it just a big group formed by migratory species that shows in more or less the same area seasonally? Well, what counts as big? What if some species aggregate intensely at a few sites and some species are more distributed more evenly across a larger number of sites? You know, what if, God forbid, migration routes overlap? How can we know which sites are really important to protect? So this isn't just a rhetorical question that I decided to ask. It's a real question that we definitely haven't answered yet in migratory species conservation. So I've got some example papers up here for you to look at, and these use a really wide range of quantitative and qualitative methods. It's really case by case, just tailored to specific taxa. And this means that the conservation policies we come up with often end up focusing very narrowly on identifying important sites in isolation from one another, because there is no widely accepted method of quantifying the extent to which different species aggregate across a network of sites. So a key example here is the Ramsar Convention, which I'm sure very many of you can have heard of. And this identifies wetlands of international importance, and it does this for water birds using population thresholds. And Ramsar is ratified by 171 countries worldwide. And as you can guess from this map of Ramsar wetlands I've got up here, this makes it really fantastic for protecting migratory shorebirds, which are just all over the world by nature. So overall, I would actually say this is probably the most widely and consistently implemented definition of aggregation that we have in migratory species conservation. This, this 1% rule, which is very common. But the thing is, you cannot use the Ramsar criteria to solve this problem because these criteria do not have a biological basis. There's no evidence, for example, that every migratory water bird forms aggregations large enough to be protected. There's also no evidence that picking major sites of aggregation one by one and protecting them is an effective conservation strategy across species. In fact, there's evidence directly to the contrary. So a case in point is the assemblage of the 37 migratory shorebirds that spend their non-breeding season here in Australia. And these species range from highly aggregated, like the red knot here, to much more dispersed and also very hard to record, like the Latham snipe. And all of these are protected under Ramsar-based criteria. So you can see the original criteria for international importance here, as well as a scaled down set of criteria for what the EPBC Act terms national importance. But even with the addition of these smaller thresholds, there are persistent issues. So if you actually look through the official directory of important habitat, you'll see that species vary really wildly in how much internationally or nationally important habitat they have. Some have none at all. And really crucially, there's no record of how heavily some species might be depending on quote unquote umbrella habitats or habitats that qualify as important for a different species that they're present in. So you can see that we're hitting on here two really essential questions in migratory species conservation. We have a biological knowledge gap. We don't know how these populations are distributed across the landscape. It's not clear how to scientifically measure it. And a conservation knowledge gap, which is that we also don't know how effectively this major sites of aggregation strategy is at protecting the populations we're so interested in. So in this study that I did for my honors, I aimed to quantify the degree of aggregation for each of the 37 migratory shorebird species that regularly occur in Australia, and then determine the proportion of their population that occurs within sites that qualify as sites of aggregation under the EPBC Act, either for their species or another. And finally, I wanted to explore an alternative conservation priority setting approach by setting a network level population target as a proportionate of each species' total Australian population, and then identifying which sites would require protection to achieve that target. So to do this, I embarked on a year of field work. No, I would like to say that is not necessary in migratory shorebird conservation in Australia. So actually, the situation that we have here is that we have a wonderful citizen science database that goes back to the 1980s. So under this program, which is coordinated by BirdLife Australia, volunteers will conduct seasonal counts across 520 designated shorebird areas. And these areas can be really large scale, like an entire estuary, or that needs to be split into multiple count areas, or pretty small and isolated, like a wastewater treatment plant. And just as a quick aside, my work now with BirdLife, which involves updating our old shorebird population estimates, has really cemented for me how special this program is, that it's gathered national data for so many decades, and it doesn't really just benefit shorebirds, There's researchers like me who are interested in asking questions about how we conserve species, how we tackle the biodiversity crisis. This wealth of data means that we can sort of use shorebirds as a proxy as well. So I think this is a really important program. So as you can see up here, this is the extent of my field work just here at my desk. And for this study, I extracted summer counts between 2005 and 2018 for each of these 37 shorebird species listed under the EPBC Act. Only one species, the double-banded plover, is known to be more abundant in winter. It's a New Zealand migrant, so I used winter counts for that one. And I also excluded the pin-tailed snipe from my analyses because there were just no records of it within the time frame I chose. And then I summarized this data set by retaining only the maximum count for each species in each SBA, or shorebird area, across all years. And to estimate the total Australian population for each species, I took maximum counts across all shorebird areas for each species and then summed them. And this is, of course, not perfect. I don't know exactly how many there are, but it's also pretty standard practice in shorebird monitoring because detectability can vary substantially among counts. So it's often more reliable to use a maximum count rather than, say, the mean. So as it stands, I'm going to go on over here. There have been no previous attempts to formally quantify degree of aggregation for migratory species, which may seem surprising, but it's true. But fortunately, aggregation is very well studied in other biological disciplines, such as parasitology, and even in, say, economics, where they're interested in understanding how wealth is distributed or aggregated across the population. So eventually I chose to use a pretty common measure called the Hoover Index. You might have seen it before, or referred to as the Robin Hood Index. That's another name for it, which I've put up here. And basically the Hoover Index determines the proportion of individuals in a sample that would need to be redistributed to achieve a uniform distribution. So say if you had a shorebird species with a Hoover Index of 0.6, that would mean that 60% of individuals in that population would have to be redistributed to achieve an even spread across Australia. And so this index, I think, has two key things going for it. The first is that it has a nice, clear biological interpretation. And really, the last thing I wanted to do was have to tell people like you guys in this webinar, look, here's a number, the explanation's super complicated if you don't have a math background or even a lot of time, but basically this number means you have to listen to me and trust me and protect these wetlands. You know, that's a really tough sell in conservation. So I wanted it to be clear and also simple. And the second thing is, this is a little more technical, but the Hoover Index is relatively robust against differences in abundance, which is really important because this entire study is about comparing an assemblage of species that form either really large or really small groups a lot of the time. So I wrote a function in R to calculate the Hoover Index for all species. And now that we've gone through all that wonderful math explanation, what I found is that species had a really wide range of Hoover Index values, ranging from 0.88 to 0.17. And rather than just showing you a beautiful table of those numbers, I thought I could show it to you. You can see these differences in these sort of classic aggregation charts. And I've arranged species from highest to lowest Hoover Index. So for each species, I've plotted the cumulative percentage of SPAs occupied, shorebird areas occupied, ordered from least abundant to most abundant, and then against the cumulative percentage of that species' estimated Australian population. So, and then each data point is a shorebird area. And so then you can see with the oriental plover on the top left, it's small groups, small groups, small groups, and then this one huge site that holds almost all of the population right in the top right. And Swinhoe snipe on the bottom right, it's kind of the opposite. You can see it's almost evenly spread, and it also has a pretty small number of sites. And you can sort of see there's two levels to aggregation here, how much a population clusters, but also how many sites it's present at. So next, to address my second aim, for each species, I determined how much of their population was present within 5 categories of sites. So sites where they directly meet their thresholds for international or national importance, and then indirect sites that qualify as important, but not because of that particular species. And then finally, sites that meet no thresholds for any species. And as you might be able to predict from my aggregation results, species were distributed in really, really different proportions across these categories. And what I want to focus on first is that the sort of Ramsar-based EPBC Act criteria actually do a really good job at including populations within quote-unquote important sites on a broad scale. But the problem here, I think, are these sort of like levels or tiers of importance. So let me make this much simpler and just leave the proportion of the population within directly internationally important sites. There we go. So these species, I think we can argue, are meant to be protected equally under Ramsar and arguably under any legislation based off of it. But you can see there's sort of a sharp drop-off here once the Hoover Index gets low enough. And you can also see species like the Oriental pratincoal, second from the top, which is the second most aggregated species on the list. And but clearly in Australia is just not being observed in numbers large enough to hit that 1% of its flyway-wide population threshold. And if you look at the species that are listed as threatened under the EPBC Act, which I've put stars next to, most of them are very well covered, but you can also see the critically endangered and just not very aggregated eastern curlew closer to the bottom there, with about 70% of its population covered. There are less endangered species here with more of their population protected. And so arguably, what I would say the system prioritizes is not the protection of migratory shorebirds, but kind of specifically the protection of large aggregations of migratory shorebirds. And in a sense, the means have kind of become the ends here. And I think this is actually a really nice example of why it's a good idea to have some kind of tangible, measurable outcome in mind when you're doing conservation. So my alternative conservation approach, I basically decided to experiment with throwing out individual site thresholds and setting an actual network level target of at least 67% of the estimated Australian population of each study species. And the reason I chose that figure is if you take the average of all these species bars here, just on the left, that are above 0, it comes to 67%. So basically, setting this particular target network-wide would ensure that all species receive at least the sort of quote-unquote typical conservation outcome experienced by species that aggregate numbers large enough to actually directly meet Ramsar criteria. So I wanted a more equitable solution. So how could the current system change under this target? So to find out, I created 2 alternative networks using the prioritizer package in R. So this package allows users to build and solve complex reserve design problems. Specifically, it uses something called mixed integer linear programming to translate user-specified targets and constraints into a mathematical optimization problem. And for the purposes of this study, I assigned a target of 67% representation for each species, and then asked Prioritizer to meet all targets with the smallest number of sites possible. And then I gave it these 2 scenarios you can see up here on the board, where I wanted to keep those major sites of aggregation, and then add on the sites that I needed to meet my target, and one where I let Prioritizer do a total restructure of this 306 site network. So how small could you get it and still meet the target? And I won't get too deeply into this. I don't know how many people find it as interesting as I do, but Prioritizer allows you to use solvers that work with exact algorithms, which means that you can set the solver to run until the most optimal solution is found. You cannot actually do this for a huge data set. It would just take a ridiculously long time, but you can do it very easily with a set of 306 sites. So that's exciting because it meant that I could find really, really, really efficient solutions within my parameters. Okay, and then if you look at the results of my alternative conservation scenarios, which I've put up here in this diagram, you can see that the current system can not only be made to be more equitable across species, but also much, 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 much more efficient. So the top-up scenario shows that with the addition of just 8 more sites, the graph you just saw earlier could be fixed to cover at least 67% of the Australian population of all study species. And then in the restructure scenario, that number gets even lower. And something I'd like to point out here is that both of these alternative scenarios share a really high number of sites, indicating that there's sort of a core set of crucial sites that are sort of being depended upon here, maybe. So I'd like to say, now that I've shown you all these results, here's what I'm not proposing. I'm not saying that, oh, we can get rid of sites. We can make this, we can make this system so much smaller and easier to manage. Because in the real world, it's not just my project. Outside of my project, wetlands have utility and value outside of their status as shorebird habitat. And I'm very aware that being able to identify a site as a quote-unquote important habitat is a useful strategy for protecting wetlands. It can be quicker and easier to count shorebirds than, say, take Ramsar criteria 4, conclusively prove that a wetland supports a plant or animal at a critical life stage. One's quantitative, the other's qualitative. It's a useful strategy. So if I had to choose which scenario would be implemented, I would definitely choose the mixed approach, so scenario 1. And with Ramsar-based criteria, you can sort of identify those internationally important, highly abundant sites, which, as we know, if you remember the passenger pigeon example, are very vulnerable. And then with systematic conservation planning, you can top up and ensure that all species of interest meet a network level target of your choice. And where I think my findings will be really useful, hopefully, is possibly in how we allocate resources for management. This is actually a really important thing to consider with shorebirds. Dr. Hannah Wochop, I hope I've pronounced her name correctly, who is in my lab before my time, just published this very interesting paper recently showing that creating protected areas doesn't necessarily result in positive conservation outcomes for water birds. it's actually figuring out how to manage these sites has a very important effect. So maybe this work could help with figuring out how to allocate management resources, so we can put it where it really makes a difference on this sort of core set of sites. And then also, who knows, but maybe with a little more efficiency in the system, we could begin to tackle this big old spatial bias you can see in this important habitat map. So you can see it's a citizen science program. There's really a lot of areas that are quite difficult to get people to survey. All right, so take-home messages. I found that a degree of aggregation varied a great deal among the 36 migratory shorebird species in Australia, and I've identified that the Hoover Index is a means of quantifying those differences in aggregation. I also found that Australia's use of Ramsar-based criteria to identify important habitat for these species has resulted in very different levels of protection across species populations. And ultimately, my level approach shows maybe not only a more equitable approach across species, but maybe one that's a little more efficient, and that similar levels of mean habitat protection can be delivered with fewer sites to sort of manage intensively. So it can help us with prioritizing which sites maybe we should really keep an eye on managing. And I'd like to close out this talk by saying it's not yet clear, of course, whether my findings are purely representative of migratory shorebirds in Australia, or whether you can actually generalize these findings. So what I mean is this study could be attempted in other countries with robust shorebird monitoring programs. And following on from there, there's potentially some very interesting and very important work to be done conducting a site prioritization similar to mine, not just on a national level, but on a flyway level to help Ramsar-affiliated countries to work together more effectively. And really, this could go beyond shorebirds. Future studies, for example, could conduct a version of this study on migratory fish, which, believe it or not, their sites of aggregation are often protected using very similar sort of population threshold strategies. It's quite similar to the migratory shorebird sort of strategy we have going, and I'd be really interested to see if you get sort of similar results with fish. I absolutely have no idea. I'm not a fish researcher. So there's a lot of work to be done, which is why I'd like to end this talk by saying that I'm about to start my PhD in October, as you know. If you have thoughts, if you have ideas, I want to hear them. I'm at UQ. I'm very happy to meet online or in person. And just finally, to close, in case you're falling asleep a little, if you liked this talk, but you thought it needed some more funny illustrations, my friend Catherine, who is a wonderfully talented artist, is developing a proposal with me for the Curiosity program in Brisbane, which commissions large-scale public art celebrating the interconnectivity of art and science. And you can see here her interpretation of a common redshank, which I told her that always sort of looked like a professional lady on the go to me. And I thought that was just a good example of the many, many avenues conservationists will use to get their work out there. You can really do anything. And with that, thank you for listening. And I hope there's lots of questions and lots of difficult ones, so I don't want to jinx myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. I'd ask everyone, if you've got questions, please just put your hand up. We've got one already, but I'm going to use my right as moderator to start off a little bit. So you're talking about, you can probably expand the analysis you've done to look at like the level of clumping and how that overlaps with Ramsar sites in other flyways, which seems really useful, especially in areas that maybe don't already have heaps of Ramsar sites or protected areas. Maybe there could be a sense of finding out where we should put the protected areas, and B, saying you should manage them rather than just protecting them. How sensitive is this, though, to like a lack of data? Because I know our flyway is super well studied, but many of the others have just really patchy data, where there's a couple of spots where they've surveyed, but others that they haven't.
Yeah, so you kind of hit the nail on the head, Dylan. And so my goal starting out with this project was our data basically it is not perfect, even in Australia where we have this wonderful monitoring system. It is far from perfect. And my original goal for this project was to say, okay, like within the network that we know about, how can we make the network we know about, how can we manage it better? So if if anyone was to start conducting this on a, on an international level or something, it becomes difficult when you encounter countries with a sort of just not very much data. But I'd be interested to just see what the situation is and have a stab at it, because there have been sort of attempts to do a sort of flyway-wide prioritization that I've looked at, but it's sort of the same old system of finding like the largest sites internationally. It'll be like a list of like, here's a huge site in Indonesia, here's a huge site in Australia, and I'd basically just be interested to see what this kind of study would throw up if you tried a network level approach rather than just a largest sites approach. But you're right, it is quite sensitive to a lack of data, which makes things difficult on an international level.
And what you're talking about there, kind of, I feel like this is a common problem in a lot of environmental or probably just general issues, where I guess politicians want one big thing that they can say they've done, and then just be done with it, rather than the complexity of a whole bunch of things managed separately in an ongoing way.
Yeah, and of course, this is, I wouldn't recommend setting any of these sort of, this core set of sites that I found, setting it in stone. Like, shorebirds don't buy property; things change over time. So it would be important to try and keep that updated.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I will go to Gina, but first, Penny had a question in the chat. Penny, if you wanted to pipe up and ask your question, that'd be nice. Otherwise, I can read it out.
I'm happy for you to read it out. I hope it's fairly clear. I hope you know what I'm getting at. It's, sort of the furry dog versus the snake. Which one do you say in the public perception? But in this case, it's the numbers. Are the numbers relevant to, because you need public support in order to do the research so that you can do the process and go through the processes? And is there a significance? Is there an attitude of, if there's only one or two, why bother? Whereas if there's 600 or 800, well, that's important because we'll notice the difference. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And Penny, I think this is a very important question, because a reason why I was sort of interested in doing maybe a network level sort of strategy was that we already have this problem where species that just don't aggregate very much, like the Latham snipe, which I like to bring up, you might find in one wetland site, there's only 2 of them or something like that. And the bias there is sort of very strong to say, like, well, it's a site with only 2 birds. How bad is it if we just lose this site? And the truth is that we need to be thinking on a much sort of wider sort of network level, which is like, maybe these species depend on a whole bunch of wetlands, and they're scattered really sparsely. So you're right, there is this really strong incentive to preserve these areas with huge numbers of birds, which I would say is a correct instinct, because if you wipe out those areas, that's a huge blow to their population. But really, what we have to do is try and accommodate species that gather in these huge numbers, that aggregate, and species that are more spread out. So things that we can see in front of us and things that we have to maybe think a little more abstractly are out there.
I think we tend to forget about the importance of the little populations.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my interests, I have a house full of frogs.
That's a great situation to be in. I'm jealous.
But I know that there are some frogs which are in danger of dying out, which are in very small populations, particularly here in the ACT and up in the Brindabellas, where if they go, we're not quite sure what effect it will have, other than it will be a negative effect. So, yeah, it's important that everything's kept in focus as far as it's possible. Good luck with your work. That sounds great.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck with the frogs. And I like your dog pictures in the background.
Oh, yes, I do. I do go in for charismatic megafauna too.
Yeah, I think cute furry things are a good starting point, but some of these difficult to see things are clearly important as well.
Yeah.
Thanks, Penny. Really appreciate that. Gina.
Hi. Firstly, can I congratulate you, Lena? What a fantastic project.
Thank you.
It's great to see someone thinking big picture on the little things. and particularly interested in how you were talking about prioritisation and whether, I guess in your PhD you'll sort of be drilling down more, but whether you've had any insights along the way to sort of help guide more short-term immediate needs in terms of conservation actions or management. So that's one thing. And the other was about data collection. Have you along the way noticed if people are sort of exploring other ways to get a lot of data at once by using technology instead, like drones or cameras or whatever, instead of just people, but supporting the citizen science?
Yeah, well, drones are sort of an exciting opportunity, and I have Josh Wilson in my lab who's working on just that, drones with also sort of AI programs to sort of recognize birds. But really, I would say at the moment, you know, it's so large scale, the sort of monitoring program. You know, it's like over 500 sites across Australia, and we've got the, you know, the help of just like incredibly sort of like skilled people, you know, who are just excellent at it. I mean, better than I think a machine could be at this point in time. I think right, the infrastructure we sort of have for this monitoring program is actually, I think, is really solid, and I can't really think of a better alternative other than sort of maybe pouring a tiny little bit more funding into it, which is quite difficult. And then I think your first question was on prioritization and sort of like guiding sort of immediate action. I think that's one of the sort of attractive things about prioritization. You know, in a world that feels like it's on fire a little, can we identify the sites that are like, can we triage sites basically? And that's sort of what I wanted to do. I wanted, if I had, you know, this sort of niggling feeling that you know, collecting the biggest sites, the biggest sites weren't necessarily the most important sites. I wanted to be able to identify, you know, what are the sites that are being depended upon here, if not those, and maybe we can sort of focus our efforts a little on those. Because at the moment, I think maybe not to ramble on, but I think a sort of a weakness of the system of internationally important sites and nationally important sites. You saw the map. It's huge. It's 306 sites, and they all sort of seem to be of like, if you look at the map, of sort of equal importance when you look at it, right? Except for the sort of tier system of international and national. So if we could really figure out the ones that are sort of heavy duty in there, that's helpful because it's a big job. Yeah.
Will that be your PhD?
So my PhD actually is I'm interested in sort of often the conceptual side of conservation science. You know, how do we save species? You know, why are we saving some species? And I think I'm interested in migratory shorebirds. I'm interested in solving this problem because I think it's a lovely thorny problem. You know, how do you save a group of species whose home is the entire world? But I also think, as I was saying earlier, sort of use them as a sort of proxy to ask other conservation questions, because you know the data is there, which is actually pretty rare. So I'll be throwing a bunch of different sort of wacky little conservation ideas I've had at that data set and seeing what I find.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, all the best.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Okay, I'll note that Kathy's posted in the chat about the Latham Snipe project at Cherubimba Wetlands. I've got a photo of a Latham snipe that I took there, which I'm pretty proud of.
I still, believe it or not, I still have not seen one over the course of this entire project.
I haven't seen one in years, and then it was sitting on a post, and someone was like, they don't sit on posts, but it was sitting on a post.
I'm very fond of them. I would like to see one.
They're cool. Oh, well, apparently there's heaps at Cherubimba, so come to ANU and give a talk at some point. John's posted in the chat. John, did you want to read out your question or ask it colloquially?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, great talk, Lena. I'm just wondering what correlations you might have found with conserving wetlands for migratory shorebirds and the role and effects they have for native species, you know, that don't migrate. And did you find a bird you like better than others?
So do you mean basically like what would my prioritization look like if I did it with sort of, you know, I'm forgetting the word now, but like non-migratory species?
Yeah, look, what are the benefits conserving sort of wetlands for migratory species? What are the sort of flow-on benefits that you find, and how do you prioritise those amongst different wetland spots?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really interested in this being like a, you know, a practical project, or one that could have maybe an effect that was sort of immediately useful. And you know, migratory shorebirds have just a stack of legal infrastructure all around them. As I mean, as you'll know, they're a great way of conserving wetlands, sort of relative. Well, not conserving them, but maybe adding a little layer of protection to them. And I guess, I mean, I focused on them because there's really so many sort of laws and regulations around them that you can actually build a pretty good case for a protected network. But I would be interested to see what this would look like with non-migratory species, and also just personally interested to know a little more about non-migratory species, because there are many birds in Australia, and I used to think I was very good at knowing about all of them, and I started this and realized I was very wrong. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, wetlands are obviously inhabited by more than just birds as well. So what are the other flow-on effects for other species? Is that something that you might look at in the future? Is it something you considered with how you prioritise
you mean
areas
like
conservation?
Yeah, like what are the impacts, you know, if we're prioritizing sort of managing these wetlands around migratory shorebirds, what are the impacts on other species that aren't migratory?
Yeah.
There we go. I finally got to your question.
Sorry, that's okay. No, that's good.
Finally entered my skull. But yeah, I mean that is a really interesting question, and I think one that kind of brings up that thing I said earlier about the means becoming the ends, which we have to be wary of, which is, you know, if I and people like me are sort of realizing, oh, you can push things through in migratory shorebirds, like let's do all these studies, and maybe you end up with an environment or a protected area environment that's optimized for migratory shorebirds. We don't actually know what the impacts of that would be. I mean, it's a huge question, but a really important one, and one that I actually hadn't thought of, despite of all my banging on about this sort of thing. So thank you for that.
That's okay. And do you have a favorite bird?
The favorite bird. So I have my. Are you asking migratory shorebirds?
Go any bird. Go the wedge-tailed eagle or something.
One of each, one migratory and one non-migratory.
Okay, well, my sort of, I would say my first love are sort of the cockatoos of Australia. I would really just like to see a palm cockatoo at this point. It's taking a very long time. And in terms of migratory shorebirds, my cheat answer is always the ruff. We get about 6 of them a year, so I don't think it counts. And they're not in their breeding plumage, so it really doesn't count. I like pictures of them. And I would say beyond that, I like the Pacific golden plover, because their babies are extremely cute. They look like little moss balls. And they're also just pretty.
That's a good reason. Thanks, Lena. That's great.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Much appreciated. Lena, for context, some of these funding proposals we get, at least in my team, the presence of migratory shorebirds in that area is kind of used as evidence for why a project should be funded or not. And it's often just basically saying, we've got records of these shorebirds being here. That's just one of the various things they're saying around why we should fund it. And it's often not very much beyond that. You know, very rarely will there's a huge population and it's this percentage. But there does seem to be a lot of overlap with waterbird habitat as well in these places. So I think there's more work to be done linking science and government decisions up in that space.
Absolutely. Like if I could have made my honors like a year longer, I would have loved to have maybe like a co-supervisor that was maybe more of a legal scholar or something like that. Rich is great with this stuff, obviously, but I don't really have, I guess, a really great grasp of sort of the sort of legal proceedings that have happened in the past or in this area, which it seems like you do. So maybe we should chat about this a little further at some point.
We should definitely chat further. I'll just mention she does more rivers, but Emma Carmody, who used to be with EDO New South Wales, Emma Carmody was the legal advisor for the Ramsar Convention for about 5 years. She's just stepped down to start a business, blue carbon restoration business, but it might be worth getting in touch with her. And
okay,
yeah, anyway, there's plenty of avenues there. Okay, Gail, you've got your hand up. You've had it up for a bit. Thanks for being patient.
Thank you, Lena, for your presentation. I just
Gail, sorry, just can you get closer to the microphone? I can't hear you super well.
Yeah, I often have that problem. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's all right.
Shouting.
Yep.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's just amazing, and just to have those innovative approaches and ideas. Yeah, absolutely amazing to hear. And I'd have to confess I could hardly keep up with you. So.
Well, I hope I was not speeding, but
oh no, I don't mean you
yeah.
spoke too quickly. I just mean my brain was, too slow in processing everything that you were saying. There's so much there to think about. One of the things you said was about the birds not buying real estate, and that they're not necessarily going to be wedded to a site, and there are all sorts of reasons why that might happen. It might be in the flyway, it might be local, it might just be somewhat random. So have you had any thoughts about how you can overcome that in a conservation sense with conservation strategies? There's a lot of effort goes into actually listing a Ramsar site. We have to update the paperwork every so often, and sometimes there aren't counts to justify a particular listing criteria anymore. So we don't even necessarily know. So yeah.
Oh, I think
Gail,
Gail,
you've
you
gone
just
on mute.
muted yourself.
Sorry. Any thoughts on how to design innovative conservation strategies for protected areas? Perhaps mobile ones, or I don't know.
Yeah, well, I have terrible news for you, Gail. I do not have a good answer to this question. I think Liz Gould, who I met at the Queensland Ornithological Conference at the weekend, asked me a very similar version of this, where basically she was sort of warning me against, getting a really stiff, inflexible list of core sites, what I'm calling core sites, that eventually, a tree might fall down, a really annoying dog moves in, and it becomes out of date. How can we make a system where we can prioritize, but it's also flexible, and it's changeable over time, and that is just a huge question that I hope to sort of pick at with my PhD. And I sort of think, I was maybe I've been bagging a little on how huge this network of important sites is, and how huge and unmanageable it is. But an upside of it being huge is that there's a lot of options, there's a lot of spillover. It's kind of flexible in that way, which is why, maybe to answer your question in a really roundabout way, I guess the sort of first scenario that I was recommending, where you keep the existing site network, but you sort of maybe continually sort of run prioritization, so where is a good idea to focus management, is maybe a system that's sort of big enough and flexible enough and focused enough, and maybe is sort of occupies sort of like a Goldilocks position there.
Great. Well, we'll watch your PhD progress with interest, and we'll keep a spare seat for you in our team.
Oh, thank you. Wait, what is your team, Gail?
We're the Wetlands team.
Oh, the Wetlands team. Perfect. And I can see Gina's question in the chat, which I just brought up, or just her comment: with climate change, reserve area boundaries may need to be flexible, which is actually something, just off topic, I've been really interested in lately. I think there have been people designing protected areas with maybe extended northern or southern reach, depending on predicted sort of changes in temperature. And I just think that's a really interesting concept. I'd love to see where that goes in terms of conservation science. Maybe it'll happen in my PhD. I have no idea. So yeah, thank you, Gail.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks, Lena. We've probably got time for two or three more questions, and I did want Linda to briefly talk about her BirdLife work. Gail, that was really useful. Thank you. And Dana's got her hand up, so I'll pass over to her.
Hey, am I showing up? Yeah, okay. Hi, good talk. Thank you. I'm interested in like a restoration perspective because I'm about to start doing my PhD on coastal ecosystem restoration. And I was wondering like if you've done anything, it's probably a bit beyond the scope of your project, but on looking at like what are the characteristics of the sites that make them so important for migratory shorebirds, and like I guess because if you understood those characteristics, you could try to replicate those when you're doing restoration. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you are thinking exactly like Hugh Possingham, who you've probably heard of, because he proposed this exact concept to me as a possibly like a PhD chapter or two. So
Cool.
yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. Of course, it's sort of a matter of knowing what features to measure. And of course, I mean, this project has been so data focused. I did not see a wetland except for once throughout the entire thing. So I would need more on the ground experience. But yeah, that's something I'm really interested in. And if you're a wetland restoration person, I'll be very, very interested to talk to you about it, because
Yeah,
I really need that information. And if there's anything I can offer you in terms of my wonderful little data set adventures, I'd be happy to.
Cool. Let's chat later.
Yeah, perfect.
Thanks, Dana. Also, if you want to give one of these talks, if you've done an honours on a similar project topic, that would be great as well. It's always good to have some people. Sweet. Excellent. All right. Justine has posted in the chat. I'm impressed by how much you've accomplished in your honours year. Justine, did you want to turn on your screen and ask your question, please?
Yeah, so I just wondered, I'm definitely very impressed by how much you got done in your honours. I just wondered, in terms of the longitudinal aspect of it, what time period did the data you were looking at cover, and were there a lot of changes across time in terms of the bird numbers at particular sites?
Yeah, that is a good pickup. I was actually hoping that someone would ding me on this for my honors presentation, because I feel like it's a nice potential hole. So good job there. So this is really sad. I've forgotten what time period I covered, but actually I probably have it in my notes. But the time period I chose, you might have remembered that I mentioned a directory of important habitat, so internationally important and nationally important sites. This directory, I literally just copied the time frame they used, it's sort of a matter of striking a balance between a large enough time period that you have enough data, and a small enough one where you're not so worried about sort of trends, increasing or decreasing, sort of messing up your project. That's sort of the reason I chose what I did. I think it's like actually. I'm really not happy with not giving you an exact answer, so I'm just going to look quickly. Yeah, between 2005 and 2018. So I think about like 13 years. But
Awesome,
obviously stuff could have declined then. It was just it's a little bit of an arbitrary choice, but hopefully it was workable. And yeah, Justine is also starting her PhD. She's at UQ. You guys are welcome to reach out to her because she's also a wonderful researcher.
Oh, thanks, Lena.
Excellent. Yeah, UQ in terms of conservation and environmental sciences generally is like really excellent. It's kind of world class.
It's fantastic. If there's anyone on this webinar who's thinking of doing a master's or a PhD or honors or something like that, I would really recommend UQ. It's not just sort of academically sort of supportive. The community we have here at like CBCS, especially where I work, it's a fantastic group of people. Sorry to run over you there. I just got excited about
really
CBCS.
That's basically my point, but more articulated, honestly, and well connected too, and in a way that is actually quite useful. You get people from NGOs or people who go on to government like myself. And I think the conversation you're having with Justine kind of touches on this kind of underlying thread all the way through, which is that you can't just block things out. Things aren't all equal. Things do change. And there's this sense of kind of a static, one variable approach to setting things out probably isn't the most useful way. My final question is, what are your thoughts on this proposal to lock up 30% of the world's lands and oceans, which our minister is going ahead with, along with a bunch of other ministers, how useful and effective that is? And can you talk a little bit about what you're doing at BirdLife, and then we will wrap up?
Yeah, the sort of 30 by 30 thing is interesting. I was actually listening to, I think, a podcast on it yesterday while cooking dinner. But I mean, first of all, I think there have actually been a couple critiques of it in terms of where are we putting these protected areas? In a lot of cases, it seems like it might be places, in maybe less developed countries where a lot of people already live, and but I'm not necessarily sure. I've just seen a little on that, but it's a complicated issue, right? Because the paper I put up from Hannah sort of points at this, but I mean, just drawing a line around an area and having it be a protected, safe area can be really helpful times. But also management is also really important in a lot of cases. So I would sort of hope that if it's 30 by 30, there's also sort of some sort of like ongoing sort of check-ins to these sites sort of organized. But I mean, also sort of the more, I don't know, Dylan, you've asked me a very hard question.
It's a really big question that the world's like grappling with.
It's obviously we want to really save these natural spaces as much as possible, and as effectively as possible. And it's a huge scale question. I try not to answer things that I do not have the most background in, and I will say this is one of them.
I do know they kicked a bunch of like these wildebeest migrations that you see in documentaries. They kicked many thousands of Maasai people out of their lands they'd been grazing for centuries to make those reserves. And in Australia, a lot of our national parks have invasive species, but they're not managed for those. So I think those points are real.
It is a little bit of an interesting ethical question, I guess. I mean, and that's actually what I love about conservation in a way, that it's there's so many sort of subjective parts to it that you have to ask yourself, what do we want our world to look like? It's not exactly like I doubt we'll be dropping a sort of conservation area like smack in the middle of Canberra or something like that. It's
I mean, we'll have a little pretty one at Mulligan's Flat that people can go walk and jog in, but yeah, definitely not going to get rid of the city. Yeah, there's some elitism in colonialism too. I think in its heritage comes from a lot of very rich Westerners. To some extent, there's also a lot of other things that are happening in the Indigenous world and from a grassroots level.
It's a big old mess, because I mean, you also I mean, at the end of the day, like it's a very populated world we live in. We also have to put these conservation areas somewhere, and and you sort of have to wrestle with the question, like, is it possible that we have a solution that isn't fair but also might be the best option? Like, no idea. It's really difficult, and I think in an abstract sense a really fun question to sort of play with, or an interesting one. Maybe fun's the wrong word.
But you can grapple with it for a long time. Penny's asked why we don't put a protected area around Canberra, as we are all endangered species.
Yeah, I will say, Penny, I have been to Canberra one time on a school field trip in year 7, and I didn't like it. It was very cold. So I would see why it's an endangered species situation. Maybe it's nice on some days.
It's nice. It's nice.
You've got to come to Canberra to see the snipe, Lena.
That's true. There might be some redeeming features beyond me, falling asleep during question time.
You have a blue-eared duck. All right. Kathy, were you going to say something? Sorry.
I'll just have
Yeah.
to stop the recording because I've got to
Yeah,
nick into
sure.
another one. But just wanted to say thank you, Lena, and we'll put you in touch with some of the state-based way to study group people, because I think having that conversation with those citizen scientists that are collecting all that data would be really, really good. So
yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm kind of excited to meet these people because I mean, I admire them. You see, like just looking at the data set, you know, you see these people who dedicate so much time and so much expertise, and it's actually, I find it really moving. It's great.
okay, best of luck. I'll just stop the recording. You can keep talking though.
Okay, sure.